Professor Lewis is a neuroscientist, professor, author, and one of the world's leading experts on the neuroscience of addiction. In his academic work, he has authored or co-authored more than 50 journal articles, and for many years was a professor of developmental psychology at the University of Toronto, and then Radboud University in the Netherlands. For the last decade, he has focused on making his work more accessible to a wider audience through books for lay readers, popular science articles, public talks, and interviews. He is the author of two best-selling books on addiction, Memoirs on an Addicted Brain and The Biology of Desire. He is currently practicing psychotherapy as a clinical psychologist in Toronto, working with clients with addictive problems and other difficulties. You can learn more about Marc's work at www.memoirsofaddictedbrain.com. And I would also really recommend checking out Marc's blog as well. He's got some great articles on IFS and how it relates to addiction. So Marc, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started. And it's great to have you with us here today.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me, Niall, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I wish I knew a bit more about who I was talking to, but at least I can be talking to you. And the rest of you, thank you for tuning in. And I will try to make this clear and accessible. So yeah, I was doing developmental psychology for many years as a prof, academia, research and all that, and teaching. And then I started to get very interested in addiction about 12 years ago, partly because I had a long stint of addiction myself in my 20s. So I really knew what it felt like. I knew what I knew very personally, the struggles, the pain, the chaos, the confusion, the difficulties, how hard it was to stop, which I finally did around the age of 30. Before I got serious about academia. And I got into it through the neurobiology of addiction. I was studying neuroscience, and there's an awful lot of attention to what's going on in the brain when people have addictive issues. And one of the first things I discovered was that people who study the neuroscience of addiction tend to see addiction as a brain disease. Because there are certain processes and functional, structural issues, changes that go on in the brain when people drink compulsively or take drugs compulsively or gamble compulsively or have binge eating disorders. They all kind of lead to the same sorts of changes. So a lot of research money went into examining these changes. And then the conclusion was, well, look, there's a real problem with the brain. I mean, for people who have opiate addictions, they can take other kinds of addictions, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. But there was really not considered to be a form of psychotherapy or talk therapy that could help people get better. And the thing was, as I learned more about the clinical phenomena, what it's like in people's lives, I discovered that I wasn't the only one who got over my addiction. Most people actually do. And I became very interested in trying to understand a different way of thinking about addiction, not as a disease, but as a learning process. So if addiction is something that you can learn, then it should be something you can unlearn. That was pretty much my foundational assumption in writing those two books. So, the brain changes are interesting. And the fact that you see similar brain changes when people fall in love, for example, it becomes, it kind of increases one's perspective. There is something compulsive, there's something immediate, there's strong attraction. And maybe less thinking and less planning and less decision-making going on. Whereas addiction most seems to be this duality, this battleground between the impulse to use or the impulse to engage in addictive activities and the wish to stop. And very strong messages, I have to stop this, this is killing me, this is wrecking my marriage, and so forth. Okay, so addiction is a learning process. It's a habit that becomes deeply embedded. Why? Because it's emotionally very compelling. It satisfies an itch, it satisfies a need. You can think of the need simply in terms of anxiety. People who become addicted to this or that are usually not feeling very good in their lives. So drinking really does make you feel better for a little while, or using opiates or whatever else it is makes you feel better for a while. And then, of course, as we all know, the wheel goes around and you feel worse the next day, and so on and so forth. So I consider addiction, I sometimes call it deep learning. It's learning something which has a strong motivational thrust to it. It it becomes extremely attractive, mainly because you use up other opportunities for making yourself feel better. Those become less available. And as a result, the thing that you're addicted to seems to be the only game in town. And that's how people get stuck. And they really do get stuck. I mean, I got really stuck in my addiction in my 20s, and it's not a nice place to be.
Sorry, Mark, just to clarify here.
Oh, yeah.
So if addiction is a learning process, what is actually happening in the brain whenever someone is developing an addiction? I heard a quote from a guy, you maybe know him, Andrew Huberman, and he says something like, addiction is a progressive narrowing of what the person is able to get pleasure from. So would you agree with that kind of thinking around addiction? It's a progressive narrowing on what you're able to get pleasure from.
Well, it's certainly a progressive narrowing. You might call it pleasure, you might just call it relief. All learning is a narrowing. When you learn to play the piano, you learn certain tonalities, certain scales. Those are the correct keys. These are the incorrect keys. That's when you form relationships. That's a narrowing. This is my person, my woman, my partner, and that means I'm not, involved with other people. Well, that's a narrowing too. When you join a religion, when you engage in psychotherapy, when you whatever, it's all addiction. Learning means that there are synaptic assemblies, there are connections between neurons in the brain that are forming, and they're self-reinforcing and they're self-perpetuating, and those assemblies of brain cells interconnecting become more and more likely to become activated on subsequent occasions, such that other synaptic assemblies, other patterns of brain activity become less and less used, less and less available. That's the way the brain works. And the brain, tries to be what isn't available or what isn't on the radar. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So where we were talking about addiction as a learning process and about it being potentially a progressive narrowing. And then you were saying how that applies to almost every area of life. So if you want to maybe continue there.
Yeah, every form of learning. Learning involves developing new synapses, new connections between the neurons, and then the weakening or disintegration of old synapses. So the brain becomes more and more efficient at doing whatever it does, whatever it's learning to do. So that progressive narrowing happens when you're learning to play football, or when you're learning the piano, or when you're falling in love, or when you're becoming a parent, or whatever it is that focuses your attention and your energy in some compelling way. There is a narrowing involved. And with addiction, that's kind of epitomizes that process.
And so from there, so that's that's where you differ from the disease model of addiction. And there's another one that is basically views addiction as like a moral problem. Could you maybe tell us about that? And then I'd be curious just to get your thoughts on IFS as an approach to working with addiction.
The moral perspective on addiction. In the very old days, a century or two ago, addiction wasn't really considered anyone's problem. It was like, if you want to drink, drink. And if you want to do whatever you do, do it. But then throughout the 20th century, for various reasons, started to be recognized as a social problem. People were neglecting their kids, neglecting their families, and so on and so forth. So it became a moral issue. And in fact, the idea of addiction being a disease came along partly to alleviate that perspective, that classification. No, it's not really their fault they have a disease. So as soon as you classify it that way, then the moral the shaming that goes on doesn't really have a place to collect. So, the disease model solved certain problems, but it also created other problems, because once you call it a disease, all you can really do is get medication and try to control it, and I'll go to AA meetings, 12-step meetings, and be, kind of told that you really have to not do this anymore. And if you do, it's not good, it's not nice, and we're not going to be happy with you. And all of those kinds of approaches grew around the idea that this is a built-in problem that you just need to control. So now, as a clinical psychologist, I've retired from academia. I've done enough research articles and all that. I'm now a clinical psychologist, as you mentioned, and I see clients for psychotherapy. And many of them do have addiction issues. That's kind of partly how I advertise myself. So I'm very interested in how we can use talk therapy to help people slow down, stop, control their use. I do that through, well, first of all, I don't tell people that they have to stop. I don't tell people, really, we don't talk very much about the actual addiction itself, except when it's really quite severe and people are walking close to the cliff edge and they just need some pragmatic steps to help them stay healthy or stay alive until we get to the heart of the matter. So so when I started doing therapy with people with addiction problems, I tried a few different styles: emotion-focused therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a lot of overlap between some of these methods. They try to get to the strong, powerful emotional issues that make people miserable, such that they start to get some sense of succor or peace or relief from their addictive habits. But I landed on IFS, internal family systems, because I just find it the most efficient, most effective way there is of dealing with these kinds of things. So IFS, I mean, the first thing I tell people, it's internal family systems. It's not family therapy. Right? If people say, well, I don't want my family to come here. It's okay. We don't do that. And it's a bit of a misnomer, but it grew out of family systems therapy in the 70s and so forth. And in family systems therapy, you'd have the mother and father and the kids all there in the room. And what people discovered was that the different family members were playing roles in relation to each other. That the kid who was acting out and defiant and skipping school was actually reacting to the father who was too distant or drinking too much or working too hard, and all of these roles were interconnected. So Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, said, well, wait a minute, it seems like there's something like that going on right here in the privacy of our own minds. There's different parts that are playing different roles, and they're not getting along very well. And some of those roles seem to be extremely troublesome and come into high relief, such as addiction, such as wanting to pursue addictions, whereas others of them remain obscure or difficult to identify. So, okay, so the way to think about IFS is that the mind is not uniform. It's not homogeneous. It has different parts. We have different parts of us, each of which has its own feelings, its own wishes, its own needs, its own agendas. And, you can think of them a little bit like mood states. When you're feeling angry, you feel one way. When you're feeling depressed, you're feeling another way. When so it's a bit like that, but it's not just feelings, it's also intentions. And there's a continuity such that these states recur over and over again. And so you can start to identify them almost as if they were subpersonalities. They seem to keep cropping up, and they look and feel the same as they did last time and the last 20 times. And of course, there's no sense that this is multiple personality disorder. There's no sense that that's pathology. Rather, that's the way the mind works. That was Schwartz's, I think, really quite brilliant intuition. And of course, he's not the first to say that. I mean, Freud also talked about different parts, the id and the ego and the superego, and Jung and Pearls, and many schools of psychotherapy who have recognized there's some diversity going on in there, developed a methodology for getting to these parts and for connecting with them and unpacking them and helping them. And that was a pretty cool idea, helping them, Okay, well, how does that work? So basically, there's two kinds of parts, protectors and exiles. And think in terms of an inverted triangle. Okay, so there's the top two vertices are two different types of protectors. One are called managers, and the other are called firefighters. So I'll explain that in a second. And the bottom vertex of the triangle are the exiles. And these poor exiles are the younger parts that are feeling pain. How are we doing? I see an unstable message. There are two types of protectors, managers and firefighters. The managers are the ones that telling you what to do, how to be a better boy or girl, to shut up and not mouth off so much, or speak your mind, or don't be so shy, or don't be so this, or don't be so that. And there's the famous internal critic, which most of us recognize, the part of us that says, don't do that again. You're not going to do that again. You're acting like such an idiot. Just stop it. And we don't really like that part very much, but it tends to keep us on the straight and narrow. And that's how it protects us. That's how it keeps us out of trouble. So that's one kind of protector. That's one of the vertices of the triangle. On the other side are the firefighters. And they're called that because their job is to put out the flames of anxiety. It's a bit cheesy, but it kind of works. So often we're just feeling crummy, crappy, anxious, isolated, depressed. And that part says, let's get high. Let's do something different. Let's get crazy. Because that part doesn't really care about the future. It cares about the present. I just want to feel better. So that firefighter is putting out the flames of the anxiety, but leaving a huge mess behind. And the mess with addiction is pretty obvious, right? You kind of mess up your life, and the next morning, your managers have to come back in and say, oh my God, you did it again, you jerk. And now we have to figure out how to clean up the mess.
Can I just ask a clarification question here?
Yeah.
So if we're talking about, the purpose of these two different parts of the system, so you could maybe say that the managers, their role is to prevent exiles getting triggered.
Yes.
And the firefighters, their role is whenever exiles get triggered, their job is to sort of put out the flames and distract us from that pain. And these exiles, these parts of us, they're usually the parts of us that are really sensitive and vulnerable, and they're carrying around a lot of trauma that we might have picked up in early childhood. And
Right.
these serve an adaptive purpose in the system. Is that right?
Absolutely right. Yeah. So, I mean, the categories are, they're not exactly perfect categories. Sometimes you get the part that wants to get high becomes somewhat like a manager because it knows that you need to have some booze in the closet, or you need to have some drugs available in order to get through the night, or whatever it is. But roughly speaking, yes, the firefighters are dealing with traumatic feelings that are coming up, and the managers are trying to prevent those feelings from coming up. So one is very present oriented, the other is more future oriented. Let's keep things under control. I mean, I think that the classifications are okay. They're not perfect, but it's a new form of therapy, and it's continuing to develop. It's the exiles, they're fully conscious, they're not conscious at all, feeling so much anxiety or so much isolation or so much depression just because somebody spoke to us harshly, just because our boss said something that was a little bit demeaning, or because our wife got cross with us. Why do I suddenly feel plunged into this awful isolated place? People's lives are not very neatly sorted, so that those strong emotions do tend to come up when they're least welcome. And really, the whole mental system, the whole system of parts, develops. I think it arises in development in order to minimize the hurt, or to minimize the pain, the shame, and the feeling of isolation. So yeah, as you say, the managers are kind of trying to keep the lid on and future oriented and keeping us under control. The firefighters are saying, the only way to control this is to get high, or, to watch some porn, or to, get online for the play games and defeat the aliens for the next 12 hours.
That makes sense. So now that we've kind of outlined the basic model of the psych according to IFS, you have your exiles at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the firefighters, and you have the managers.
Right.
How would you say that this relates to addiction within somebody? What is happening in terms of when something's becoming addicted and whenever they're acting out an addictive process according to IFS?
So it's pretty straightforward. I mean, you've got the firefighter is all about getting high or things like that. It could be watching porn. It could be being completely obsessed with the sports team. And all you want to do is sit there and, be taken away by watching your team, pulverize the other guys. But let's just say it's drugs. Let's say it's substances. And that's what the firefighter's doing. And meanwhile, the managers are saying, the critic is the main manager here, is saying, I can't believe you're doing this again. You said you were never going to do this again. Your wife already gave you intense shit for doing it last night, and you're going to do it again tonight. Are you crazy? And they're demeaning and shaming and punitive. Meanwhile, what that does is it just further inflames, so to speak, the exiles at the bottom of the pyramid, because they're the ones who are absorbing more and more shame, more isolation, more anxiety. I feel like a horrible person. I am a horrible person. I keep doing this thing. No wonder everybody hates me. So that's kind of accumulating down there. And then the firefighters are saying, well, I know how to make you feel better. I can make you feel better right now. I'm just going to call up our dealer and you can feel better within, 45 minutes. And okay, let's just go there, right? Which further inflames the critic, and the critic is saying, I just can't believe you're such an asshole that you would do this again. And so the kind of self-denigration and shame and stigma that addicts acquire is really the accumulation of those processes. And then you start to see, when you do this kind of work, that there's more flack going on between these different voices within ourselves than there is between ourselves and the other people in our lives who might be quite disappointed in our behavior. Like, well, that's not very nice to know that other people think that I'm a real jerk because I keep drinking, way more than I should. Rather, it's this part of me that keeps criticizing me and punishing me for doing this. And you can't get rid of that part because it's right in here. You can't turn it off. Well, except by drinking more, right? So that becomes a duality that becomes an ongoing confrontation, which tends to get worse and worse with time. Okay, so in IFS therapy, what you do, first of all, is you try to become cognizant of these parts. You try to identify them. And to do that, you have to move a little bit away from them. You create what they call unblending, because it feels like those parts are just me. But no, they're not entirely you. They're parts of you. And as you create some of that distance, it enables you to actually dialogue with the parts, to address them, kind of like, okay, I can see that you're suffering. Okay, I can see that you're really mad at me. I can see that you're being really critical, and no wonder. And I guess, yeah, you've given up on me. And that internal dialogical process, it goes on in the therapy room. You coach people, you help them to talk to their parts. And as they talk to their parts, they get to know them better. They actually get to know the rough feelings, the difficult feelings, the pressures, the intensities. So that's the first step. And then you talk to them and you say, I need a little bit more space here because I want to talk to the other guys down there, down in the unconscious part of the mind that are younger. And, it's like the reason why you feel so isolated and so alone and so shamed right now is because your father told you over and over again that you were never going to make it, no matter what you did. He kept saying, you're not good enough. And when you find those experiences, then you're finding the exiles that feel segregated and isolated and demeaned, and they just always feel that way. And you connect to those feelings. It could be pretty emotionally overwhelming. So what you do then is you help people to soothe those parts. And it's literally a matter of soothing. One of the strangest things, and you and I have talked about this, is saying to those parts, I'm with you. I'm there with you. It's okay. You're not all alone. And believe me, the people who have addiction issues or lots of other kinds of issues, they go back pretty quickly to crying themselves to sleep at night and living in a home that working very well, a family dynamic that was aversive and destructive. And they're there, and then you hang out with that little kid, and you say, and you pat him, or you hug him, or you hang out with him, and you say, I'm with you. And that really sounds odd. I'm with you. Who's the I and who's the you? And it's all really just parts of yourself, right? So the other, I think, stroke of genius in IFS is that they've developed a sense of what they call self with a capital S, the self, which ironically is kind of equivalent to the non-self in Buddhism. It's or other spiritual kinds of enterprises. It's a place where you feel centered and you feel peaceful, and you feel it's a place where you don't really have needs or agendas or wishes or requirements. You're just there to watch, to listen, to notice, and to care. And that's a big deal in IFS, is the caring, it's the compassion. So when you start to find that place, and it's often very much hidden at first, because you're so used to being either in the throes of criticism or in the throes of getting high, but you start to notice there is a part of you that can sit back and actually care for both of those entities. I get why you want to get high. I get why you need to get more drugs now. I know that that's how you feel. Let's just be with that for a little bit. I'll stay with you and see if maybe you don't have to do that tonight, or maybe we can just take a little bit and not all of it, or maybe we just can stop after 3 drinks. I mean, you can actually negotiate, but you do it from a place of compassion and caring. And the more you do that, the more you kind of acquire a sense of self, what they call self, which really does feel quite nice. It's a nice place to be. And people often say, "Ooh, I like this place. I think, I could go for this." And it almost becomes an alternative to getting high or getting drunk, which doesn't feel quite as good.
That makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me of the metaphor that Dick Schwartz uses around, he says the self is almost like the sun, and the parts can sometimes, when they blend, they're like clouds covering the sky. And then the sun's always there, but we can't always see it because the parts are there, are in the way, Yeah. And we interviewed a lady, Janina Fisher, recently for this summit, and she's an IFS therapist as well. She's mainly specialized in trauma. And the thing that she was sort of getting at was that the most important variable in mental health and well-being, according to Janina, was secure attachment. And for people that come to therapy, a lot of them have insecure attachment. And IFS is essentially a way or a technology for creating internal secure attachment. So creating a secure attachment between yourself with a capital S and these different parts of yourself, these parts of yourself that are protecting you, or these parts of yourself that are really hurt as a child or whatever, and to me that makes a lot of sense. And I think if it can do that, it's a powerful way of healing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that works pretty well. I mean, secure attachment means a sense of being loved or cared for by a caregiver, someone that you need. It's a metaphor for how you connect to these parts, but you do give them love and care, and you give them messages of acceptance and understanding. So yeah, it works like that. And also you also tend to give them trust, as happens with secure attachment. Securely attached little kids or babies, they don't always have to be with mama. They can go off and play as long as they know that there is a mama to come back to. So the parts do start to transform. They start to become less intense, less on edge, less desperate, and they become more relaxed and more, okay, feeling this way is not the end of the world. There's the rest of the system, and I live there, and I can go back there when I need to. So even urges, and that's a big deal in addiction, cravings, urges to take stuff, become less preoccupying, less intense, less demanding. When you say, yeah, well, I could, maybe I don't really have to tonight. And so the parts are changing, right? They're becoming more secure in a sense. I think one of the most interesting dialogues that transpires is when you start to connect with your internal critic, who usually you just hate that one. He says, leave me alone, get off my back. You start to understand the critic as an entity that has developed probably throughout your, well, I find that mine has been around since my early teenage years, if not earlier. Think before you speak. You're going to get people mad at you. Again, just stop it. Just be quiet now and be nice. And then you start to see that critic as really caring and being kind of itself a little bit desperate. I don't know what to do with you, so I'm just going to tell you to be quiet for now. Just shut up. But you say, well, it's not just mean. It also actually is trying to help in its own way. And then you see the underbelly of that one. You see the softness, you see the care. Even that part is trying to help. And that's quite a transformation in the internal landscape.
100%. And I think it's really, really important to be able to realize that these parts of ourselves that we really don't like the internal critic, whatever, they're serving an adaptive purpose. And it's about, IFS is maybe about getting into a dialogue with those parts and getting them maybe helping us rather than always putting us down, And something I wanted to ask about as well, Mark, is Dick Schwartz is saying that we shouldn't go directly to exiles. Whenever you're working in therapy, you should never go directly to the exiles because they're very vulnerable, and doing so is going to cause like a kind of almost like a backlash from these other parts that are protecting us, the firefighters and the managers. What are your thoughts on that? And what I'm really asking is, why is it important to first speak with, it sounds ridiculous to even asking this, but why is it important to first go to the protector parts first before you go to these really vulnerable, hurt, traumatized younger versions of ourselves?
He does emphasize that for sure. And indeed, if you go straight to the exiles, and you suddenly can feel the intense emotions of fear and shame are the big ones, I guess. And they do seem overwhelming, and that can drive people into more self-destructive behavior. But I don't know. I think sometimes the exiles are just right there. And sometimes people can connect with the parts of them that feel really isolated and helpless. It just comes up. And if you're very gentle about it and really help them connect that sense of self, sense of caring with those parts. I've had clients guys who come in, macho guys ready to fight any man or denigrate any woman, and it's just real jerks, right? It's real tough guys, ready to jump out of their car and start a fight. And within like 3 or 4 sessions, they remember that they cried themselves to sleep at night while their father was out carousing and their mother had left the marriage, and how desperate and alone they were. And okay, let's just go and be with that kid for a few minutes and see if we can let him know that we're here, you're here, and I'm here with him, and he's not so all alone. And when you do that kind of thing, you can connect with the exiles pretty quickly. So it's not all or nothing. It's there are different ways into the system depending on how it's constructed.
Very cool. And you mentioned earlier that the self in IFS, it's maybe comparable in some way to, Buddhist conceptions of the self with a capital S. But it seems that the difference here, at least according to this model, is that the self is actually plays an active role in healing. And it's not just something that sort of observes, like it's something that is spontaneous and wants the person to heal, which I think, if you really wrap your head around that and you take the time to really think that through, if that is the case, that has some really big implications, and it's a really empowering view of human nature, that you have this part of you inside that is wise and wants you to heal and can help you heal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very optimistic, very generous, and nurturing way to think and to start to feel about ourselves. The other thing about the self is that you can find that it has a fair bit of strength. I mean, you feel kind of, battered around by these parts. I want to get high, I don't want to get high, I better not. And you just feel battered around. When you feel in self, as they call it, or self energy, and that part can say, I can take care of you. I'm here. I mean, it sounds a bit bizarre. I'm here. Well, but actually, it does feel like that. You say, and you start to feel that is where you're coming from, and that you really do have the strength and the confidence to take care of the different parts, so that that fierce critic doesn't have to be, giving you shit constantly, because you can take care of the addictive one. You can take care of the one who wants to just escape. No, it's quite a marvelous thing. I think it's a really an excellent system for getting down to the nuts and bolts of people's psychological problems quite quickly, quite effectively.
100%. It's sort of like, it's similar to our last talk on schema therapy. It's like you're becoming like the parent of all these kids that are in your own system,
Yeah, very much like that. That's a good way of putting it.
And I wanted to ask as well, you've started working as a clinical psychologist in the past year or so, or maybe a bit longer. Whenever somebody comes to an IFS therapist, let's say I was to come to you and I was to say, look, Mark, I'm really struggling with an addiction here and I need your help. I don't know what to do. How would you approach that from the point of view of being an IFS therapist? What would your approach be?
Maybe I would start off by telling them that I'm not going to tell you, you need to stop, because they've been told by everybody that you better stop right now or you're dead, or your life is destroyed forever. And I first make it clear, I'm not going to pressure them and push them into doing what feels so incredibly, helpless and destructive. And then I say, okay, well, this is the kind of therapy I use. I explain it in, 5 or 10 minutes. And after I get to know them a bit, of course, listen to their life circumstances. And we just start right in and say, okay, so, last night, when you called your dealer and got some fentanyl, and, like you've been doing a lot of lately. And I know you know how dangerous that is. It's like, so what were you feeling then? What was going on? I felt horrible and alone, and I felt, I just really I'm not ready to stop yet. And you get into it, you get into the feelings. And before long, it's pretty easy to separate out the part that wants to get high from the part that's scolding and criticizing and punishing you for wanting to do that. And as soon as you get that duality on the table, people relate to it quite quickly. They say, yeah, no, that's pretty much what's going on here.
100%. So it's really becoming aware is the first step. Helping the client to become aware of these different parts that are maybe within them, and how they're maybe warm with each other. And then how does the therapy look on an ongoing basis, on a week by week basis? Like whenever they come back for the second and third and fourth sessions, what are your sort of steps then to help them break the addiction?
Yeah, like I think implicit in the therapy, maybe as in other therapies also, is the idea that you want to give these tools to the client. I mean, you want to help guide them and teach them how to do it themselves, right? So we practice it. It's kind of almost, I kind of go in there with them. I mean, I try to just really get settled and get into myself, and so that I can follow what's going on there. And you give them little guideposts, little signs, like someone is saying it's not letting you go there. There's a part of you that seems really upset about what we're talking about now. Let's see if we can find that part. Let's see if we can ask that part what it's afraid of. And that might be a manager part, could be. And so you use guided imagery a fair bit. I mean, one of the things that Schwartz emphasizes is trying to find the parts in or around your body. You identify them. It's a feeling state. It's in your stomach or your chest or behind your shoulder or in your right arm if you feel like punching somebody. And once you identify them, you're able to move around from one to the other. You just teach them how to do that. You guide them. And it catches on pretty quick. I mean, for some people, they're in pretty good shape within, a month or two. Some people it takes 6 or 8 months, takes longer. People who have had really difficult histories with abuse, especially sexual abuse, which really messes people up, as you know. It can take a year or more. It can take a year and a half to really get down there and help to heal, soothe, care for the parts that have been so badly damaged.
That's very well said. It seems that a big part of this therapy is all around, I suppose, cultivating that relationship with the self and really bringing that to the fore. Making that the leader, like the internal leader of your life. How can people best do that? For someone listening to that, how can they cultivate that relationship and make it stronger?
One of the things that Schwartz says, you don't build the self. You rather, like you say, with the sun and the clouds, you let it come out. You give it room to come out. You let it express itself. So, it's a bit hard to put into words, but there's a definite feeling to doing that.
I really like that, actually. So it's a matter of, it's almost like relaxing all these different parts that are always like protecting you and everything. And then once that happens, it comes to the surface.
Yeah. And compassion is a really powerful way to access it or to let it come out. Because for whatever reason, in Buddhism and many other spiritual traditions, compassion's a big deal. It's kind of the essence of, who we are at our best.
100%. There's a whole therapy developed around it, compassion-focused therapy. Are you aware of this approach?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. So that is, yes, you're right. It's tapping the same thing in a slightly different way. Yeah.
You've done a great job of providing an introduction to IFS and its application to treating addiction.
I'm curious, is it, in your opinion, always necessary to work with the exiles, or could it also sometimes be enough to just work with the managers?
No, I think you do have to work with the exiles. I mean, I find that very powerful. And those are where the strongest emotions seem to reside. So especially fear and shame. And that's the part where you go back into a person's history. You talk about what it was like for you when you were 7, when you were 6, when your father was actually started punching you or punching your mother or whatever it was. And what a horrible thing. And you've kept that, locked in for all these years, but it's still there. And it's still very, very much present in your feelings. I don't see how you could complete the therapy without addressing those feelings that haven't gone away for all those years.
Okay. Yeah, it's because I've been working with IFS a while, and I'm a hypnotherapist, so I'm quite used to work with inner child work, which is very similar to working with IFS. But already the compassionate way of addressing those manager parts can already make a big difference in how people approach their own feelings, their own parts, their own compulsiveness. I already see a lot of progress there in my clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly a big part of it. But, you know, if you're dealing with someone with obsessive compulsive issues, you want to deal with the over control. It's a manager kind of thing. But you also, what is the fear about? Well, you're afraid of hurting other people. You're afraid of uncleanness, germs. You're afraid of being hurt yourself. Where do those fears come from? And in IFS, it's just considered a given that you don't leave that stuff, you know, blank. You go in there and you try to sort it out in a compassionate way. And I think it's just a really powerful part of the therapy.
I've got a client who's very sort of aware of her perfectionist parts and her controlling parts and can access her wise self. Mm-hmm. And I've been using EMDR type techniques as well as these sort of subpersonalities. My problem is that she's still living with a very crazy critical mother who is invading her boundaries all the time. Mm-hmm. And so she's still being triggered. It's not like she's left home now and her and I can sort of work with her now. She's in a safe space. She's not. Mm-hmm. So I'm just, you know, is it possible for me to sort of work with her? I'm trying. But is it possible for me to work with a client who's still in an ongoing sort of difficult situation, really?
Well, it sounds like it's not possible to completely resolve her difficulties as long as she's in that context.
Yeah.
So, you know, an IFS type interaction would be, seems to be parts of you that feel that you can't leave. There must be a reason. Why? See if we can find the part that's afraid to leave. See if we can find the part that says, you know, I'd better stay here either for her own safety or for her mother's safety. You don't know. But you would try to address that part and say, well, what do you think would happen if I did leave? What do you imagine would happen? Well, I imagine that, you know, my mother would, you know, I don't know, get sick and die, or imagine that I would, you know, whatever it is, address the part and you say,
I like that idea. I thank you. Having said that, you know, she's living in North London and it's bloody difficult to get enough money to leave. You know, there's a practical reality, but she now has a job where that's more possible.
So that's a good thing. But yeah, of course, psychological problems are often embedded in sociological and economic problems. So that's a real drag. Yeah. It's hard to deal with those as a psychologist, of course.
Yeah.
Right. But you can at least help her to connect with and to soothe the part that's afraid. Yeah. And that you can do.
Yeah.
That much.
Yeah, I think I went to a sort of little 5-year-old part this morning, and she got herself so sort of anxious that we had to come back to you know, for the end of the session, had to come back to more of a safe space with a wise light around her in order to sort of calm her. She's just starting a new job tomorrow, so it doesn't help.
No.
So and that's sort of triggering a sort of anxious, you know, old anxious child, you know.
Yeah, it's good to help people, you know, gird for battle sometimes.
Yes, that's right.
Just want to say a huge thank you to Marc for taking the time to give this talk today. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I've learned a lot as always from you. Where can people find you online? What would you recommend people to check out after hearing this talk if they want to kind of deeper dive, I suppose?
Yeah, you're welcome, Neil. It's great talking with you too. You understand these things really well. But yeah, so I mean, there's my books on addiction. There's the second of which is the biology of desire, and there are narratives of people's struggles and how they eventually overcame them, built in with some of the neuroscience and some of the psychology of what's going on. But it's since that book, since I've gotten into IFS. Mostly I've just blogged about it and done, you know, podcasts and lectures and stuff like that. And those are available on my website. As you say, it's www.memoirsofanAddictedbrain.com. Nomenclature, however it works, and or else Understanding Addiction. My website is called Understanding Addiction. If you look up Understanding Addiction and Marc Lewis, you will find it. And then look at the blogs. And about a year ago, I had a series of 5 or 6 posts about IFS and addiction. I went into it in some detail, and so that might be a good place to look. And I've also got a list of talks and articles, and you could look up interviews and podcasts in which in the last few years I have talked about this approach, as much as I can.
100%. Well, Marc, thank you so much. If anybody wants to do some sort of follow-up stuff, just in terms of what the Weekend University have produced as well, we've done another interview with Marc where we cover a lot more about the work into his research into the neuroscience of addiction. And there's also a great conversation with Marc and Dick Schwartz and Gabor Mate. And there's 3 sort of different views on the subject, but also there's quite a bit of convergence there as well. So it's a really good conversation. Thank you all so much. And Marc, I'll see you soon. All right. Take care.
In Toronto. Okay. Looking forward to it.